As you have already seen, we can also pause and rename a cluster. What is the purpose of pausing a cluster? So let's say you have a workload which runs only a few hours a day or certain times of the day. So let's say from morning 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. your cluster runs, your workload runs on Redshift. And let's say from 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. the Redshift cluster is not used at all. And from 6 p.m. your batch job runs or starts running, which uses Redshift, or ETL process starts running, which uses Redshift as either source or target. And let's say that runs for 8 hours. So let's say from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. your batch job runs or other processes run, which use the Redshift cluster, but from 2 a.m. the cluster is not used at all till 9 a.m. in the morning. If you see in this particular pattern, the Redshift cluster is not getting used the entire day. So it is running only for a few hours of the entire day. So you can optimize the cost by pausing the Redshift cluster during that particular duration and do not incur any cost. But let's see how that happens. So as I already mentioned, you can actually pause and resume the cluster. The biggest advantage of pausing is that the compute billing is not charged. So during the duration, when your Redshift cluster is paused, the compute will not be charged. So the node types that we have, right, that we have seen, DC2.large, DC2.8x large, then RA3 node types, all of them have some per hour billing. So if you pause that, the billing would also be paused, meaning that will not be charged for the compute, but the storage cost is incurred, meaning that whatever data you have stored in those clusters, either it is DC2 or RA3, the storage cost will be incurred. So what are the steps of pause? So when we pause a cluster, Redshift creates a snapshot and then it terminates all the queries that are currently running in that particular cluster. Then it terminates all the queries that are currently running in that cluster. When you press the pause button, these two things would happen. The snapshot would be created and the queries will be terminated. And then the Redshift cluster would be paused and you will not be charged for your compute. The next thing is rename. We have also seen that when you click on the edit button, you can rename a cluster. So when you rename the cluster, the endpoint name changes and your cluster will not be available until the new name is effective. So once you change the name, the cluster will be rebooted and all the existing connections will be dropped. If your applications are connected to your Redshift cluster, all those connections will be dropped. You'll have to reconnect to the cluster again. So that's what pausing and renaming does in your cluster. So that's how you can do, or you can pause a cluster and rename a cluster. Let's look at a demo or hands-on. Let us go ahead and rename the cluster first. After renaming is done, I'll pause the cluster. To rename a cluster, we'll have to click on edit. And here I'll have to change the name. So currently the name is AWS Redshift cluster. I would rename it as Data Engineering on AWS Redshift cluster. So that's all. You have to just change the name and click on Save Changes. If I go to the cluster console, the renaming is being done. So if I refresh and you see the name of the cluster has changed and the status is still modifying because a snapshot is getting created behind the scenes and the cluster is getting renamed. I click on this, the status is again modifying. Once the modification is done or once the rename is complete, this Redshift cluster would be available then. Now during the rename process, we cannot use the cluster. If you refresh after some time, the status of the cluster becomes unavailable because, as I said, during the rename process, you cannot use the Redshift cluster. So currently the status is unavailable. After some time, when the entire rename process is done, the cluster would be available again. Now after some more time, if you see, the cluster has come into available state, so the renaming was done. Now the cluster identifier has been changed to Data Engineering on AWS Redshift cluster. Now if you see, the endpoint has changed, so has the JDBC and ODBC URL. So this is how we rename a cluster. Now the next thing is that we want to pause the cluster. So how do we do that? Click on actions and just pause the cluster. That's it. Either you can pause now, we can pause it later. So if you click on pause later, we'll have to mention a schedule name and pause time, and of course we'll have to give some permission. Or we can create a schedule of pause and resume. So as I told you, the pattern that I discussed, that's a known pattern which happens on a daily basis. So in that case, you would like to pause the cluster at a certain time for a certain duration and resume the cluster at a certain time for a certain duration. So if we know the pattern of usage of a Redshift cluster, we can create a schedule also. These are the three options available. So if you click on pause and resume on schedule, we have to mention a name. We can mention the start date and end date. And if you do not provide any end date, the schedule would continue until the cluster is deleted. We can mention a schedule using this particular option. So where you can mention week, every week on a daily basis at a particular time, or we can use cron syntax also. If you do not know cron syntax, it's a scheduling syntax for Linux systems. We can mention that, and we'll have to provide a IAM role. But I'll not do that. What I'll do is I'll just pause now. I'll click on pause now, and it gives me an error that I cannot pause clusters with disabled system snapshots. So I'll have to enable the system snapshot, and then only I can pause this cluster. Let me go ahead and change the snapshot schedule. Go to clusters. This is the cluster that we have. Click on edit. So what I'll do is that I'll enable automated snapshot. So to enable, I'll have to mention the retention period to be 1. I'll keep everything as is. Click on save changes. Again, it will go into modification state. It'll take some time for the cluster to be available. After the cluster is available, we can go ahead and pause the cluster. And as we have enabled a cluster snapshot, we can do an elastic resize also. The cluster is available now. I have changed the snapshot retention period, automated snapshot retention period from 0 to 1 days. Also, I have created a manual snapshot. But the reason I have done it because I wanted to pause my cluster. Now, if I pause my cluster, I'll be not charged for this dc2.large compute node. And the number of compute nodes is 4. Meaning, if I go to the Redshift pricing page, this is the on-demand pricing, and we are using on-demand pricing only. So if you see, a dc2.large has a price of $0.25 per hour, and I have 4 nodes, so it will be around $1 per hour. And if I pause this cluster, that charge will not be incurred, only the storage charge will be incurred. So I'm pausing this cluster now. So I'll not be charged for 4 dc2.large node types at 25 cents per hour in North Virginia, but I'll be charged for 640 GB, which is much less compared to compute price. So now the cluster would be in paused state, and I can keep the cluster as is for a longer duration of time without paying any charges.